Hello and welcome to today's panel, Story versus Characters, which is more important? I have some pretty awesome authors with me. Let's shoot it over to you ladies. Tell me about yourselves. Whoever wants to go first.
I guess I'll go first. So my name is Maura van der Linden. I'm here partly because I'm an author and partly because I'm actually a freelance content and development editor. So I have a little bit of a different take on some of these things and like to argue. I guess maybe that's part of it too. Wrote under the pen name of Mara Anderson for quite a while. Gotten the rights back to some of my books, so I'll put them out again by myself. And have some interesting things like the Great Egyptian Steampunk coming up.
That does sound absolutely awesome. Totally something that we've never heard of. Love it.
Something weird, yes.
Definitely. Who's on next?
I guess I will jump in. I'm Gigi Silverman. I have one book out. It's called Vegan Teenage Zombie Huntress. It is a young adult comedic feminist horror novel. And it's sort of billed as like a mashup of like Daria, Mean Girls, and Shaun of the Dead. Aside from that, I also write short stories that sort of straddle the line between like literary horror, science fiction, and then just some like short prose and poems. And I like to do everything. So yeah, character is kind of near and dear to my heart. So I'm very excited for this discussion. So thank you for having me, Andy.
That's awesome to have you here. EM, you got something for us?
Yeah, I'll go. My name's Ian Whitaker, and I am an upcoming author. My first book, Turbulence, will be coming out near the middle of October. It is a paranormal urban fantasy book interlaced with crime and magical workings. I've also done some short stories, which are pending approval with a publishing house. But I am happy to be on this panel. That way I can learn some things and give my input. So thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, awesome to have you. Okay, so now obviously we're going to throw that big old question out there. Story versus character, which one's more important? Maura, because you come from the editorial side of things, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I'm a big proponent of, if I don't care about your characters, I really don't care about your world. So if I take the most fascinating world you can think of, and if you put a character in there that's sort of like this stick figure that just sort of walks around and you don't empathize with and you can't get into their head, you start to lose interest in the world because that's your POV to the world, is that character and its interactions with it. So I don't care if you have the most beautiful cover art, scene setting, whatever. If I don't care about the character in the first chapter or two, I usually will just not go further.
Anyone else have a contrasting or agreeing position?
I would have to agree with Maura. I am definitely of the same mind. If a character doesn't click with me within the first couple of pages, I'm usually out of the story. And I definitely agree with what you said about the character being sort of like your lens to the world. But I think it kind of like, it reaches deep into kind of how our societies are built and how the way the human, body and mind are built. Like we have like all these mirror neurons, right, that like connect us to other humans. And like we're trying to connect all the time. And I feel like fiction is made more real by the presence of, a person, albeit fictional, but like it becomes real in your mind. And I think being able to connect on a personal level with a character makes your story all that much more real. So agreed.
Definitely. I know being a fantasy writer, there's almost nothing in your fantasy world that is real, or what we know is real. Everything is very fantastical. So you have to give people something to cling to. And a good character that is someone that they can relate to, that's something that they can hang on to and really sink their teeth into. And then the world, they're more willing to buy this world or this magic system or this political system that you've created. So I definitely agree. EM, you got anything for us?
Yeah, I think one thing we have to consider as well is that most people are talking about how main characters, if you're not drawn to them, but you also have to have secondary characters that people can relate with as well. And I found this out while I was drafting the last couple of times, is that people like secondary characters more than the mains. So I had to go back and build upon them. But when you find that you have all these characters, some of them, you could hate that character, but you can relate to them, and that can draw you in as well.
Interesting. So supporting characters are almost as important as main characters. Can you think of any examples of books that you've read where a supporting character almost did more for you than a main character?
Actually, Lies of Locke Lamora has kind of that feel, because you're not only focusing on Locke, you're focusing on his best friend, you're focusing on the woman that he, pines for and eventually meets again. You're focused on his mentor or on these twins that, he interacts with, or even the people that he works for. They each have a story. They each have a part. And even if you don't like them, and even if you can't associate with them, like you don't agree with their morals, but you understand their character and why they're doing the things they do. It's kind of like watching Society, where you see somebody get mugged or you see somebody beating up somebody, but you can understand, in a sense, what drives them to it because you can relate in some level.
Interesting.
I don't think you should ever have what I refer to as paper doll characters. Even walk-ons that are flat, that there's no substance to them, there's no purpose to them being there. It's like when you occasionally run into, especially newer writers, that sort of have their character look at themselves in the mirror and have some conversation with themselves in order to tell the reader something. People tend to use some of these secondary characters as that sort of reflective surface to learn something about their main characters, and they forget to flesh out those secondary characters at all. So, if you're just meeting a waitress who's serving you breakfast, and there's no purpose other than an interaction to buy breakfast, that's one thing. But if you're meeting a secondary character that has, a name that you bring up, the more attention and the more you flesh out the character, the more the reader is going to expect that character to somehow be important in some way to the story, and will start paying attention and will feel shortchanged if you just sort of, you learn a whole bunch about this character and then poof, you never see him again.
Interesting. So overdeveloping is just as bad as underdeveloping in essence.
And that often is the source of people liking a secondary sort of throwaway character more than the main character. A lot of times it's the author has overdeveloped that secondary character to the point where that amount of attention on them subconsciously says to the reader, this is important, I need to pay attention, I need to learn this character, I need to get in this character's head, and then they just disappear, and the readers feel shortchanged. So, and it's, if you're doing that to build up a character that you're going to use in a new book or another book or something, you're going to follow them later on, that's a very purposeful thing to do, because then you'll get people crying, what about so-and-so? I want to hear more about so-and-so. And that's purposeful, right? But if you do it with no intention of ever following up on it, it really can cause some questioning and kind of hard feelings sometimes later down the road.
Interesting.
I would have to agree. I think that's one thing I rely on my beta readers for. Hey, why is that person there? What's happening with them? And so thank you. Now I need to cut them possibly. So yes, those are all really helpful ways of looking at like who's integral and who's not. So definitely.
Well said. Now I'm going to go, just because this is a debate, story versus character. I'm going to be versus. I've read some stories that the character was a really fascinating character, or they had the potential to be. They have a great backstory, they've got great powers or abilities, whatever. And then the author goes and does this story that just meanders and goes nowhere, or gets nowhere for 90 pages, and then the last 10 pages is a rush of climax. if you have a great character, you have to take it somewhere, and that's where a good story comes in.
I agree that you need a good story, but I think there are characters that survive without a good story sometimes. That the character themselves becomes the story in themselves. So if you've, let's see, what's a good, to pull something just out of my hat, some of the Hercule Poirot stories.
Okay.
Poirot as a character is a really kind of fascinating character if you know his backstory and you know things. And the first story or two were pretty interesting, but there are some of those stories that are just, they're very much a product of their time. So you look at them now and it's kind of like, oh God, are we ever going to, do anything? Because they'll wrap everything up in the last 2 minutes. Right?
Yeah.
And not much happens in between. And you're kind of like, okay, we're lingering, we're talking, we're walking down the street. But yet the character is still interesting. And you'll follow it for the character. I think maybe in the hopes of getting a better story out of it, but the character still survived those stories. It survived those not good worlds, those not good stories, and went on. So I sort of agree, but I sort of don't. When you say which one is most important, I mean, as an editor, if you don't have either one, I'm never going to read past the character.
Yeah.
If you have one or the other, I'll probably coach you to improve the one that's lacking. But I don't think I would ever buy one that only had one of the two. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No.
So I don't think it's a cut and dry, black and white kind of, must have this and this is whatever,
No, I think the best novels or stories are ones that have both great characters and something that happens to those characters that make you want to keep reading.
Right.
Yeah, I have to agree with that as well, because if you have a good character that's immersed in the story, that can grab your supporting characters and that can interact with the world that you made, then everything's going to mesh together. If you've got one or the other and you're lacking in it, readers are going to see it within the first chapter or two and put it down.
Very true. Very true. I think for me, I like to use the first couple of chapters of a book to sort of give a feeling for the character, a feel for the character and let's say their emotional state. But then after you've introduced a new character or a new main character, I'm going to say starting a new novel, if you don't do anything with them or if you take too long to do something with them, then it makes it a little hard to read. Like I've read a couple of indie novels. I do book reviews on my blog, and I've read a few of these indie novels. And unfortunately, they are in the paranormal/paranormal romance genre. Not that I have anything against it. These books just happen to be in that genre. And it was really focused on, okay, we developed this character. We've given them this depth, which is very important. But then we take forever to go the next 10 chapters to actually get to where something happens to this character. Something interesting, something that gets my blood rushing and my heart pumping, and I want to find out what happens next. They take so long focusing on character development that I don't ever get around to reading the story because, it's just another one of those,
That almost violates one of the rules that, I don't remember which author taught it to me. That your story should always begin when the character's world changes. Not before, not the prelude so you can say, oh, this is how the character world is. Here's, then, oh no, the sky falls or something, right? But the actual story begins when that change happened.
When the sky falls.
So when the sky actually fell, that's the start of the story. So you'll find people who have written a huge amount of the backstory, sky falls one chapter. And you feel gypped because there's really not a lot of story there. But you meet others where, oh no, page 2, the was it Dark Angel where the toilet seat fell from the Skylab and hit her or something. Page 2, and all the rest is, oh no, a new world.
Yeah.
A lot of times that's an inability of either the authors knowing when to start the story, because you can become very attached to your character and their backstory and how they're changing because you've seen it happen and you felt it happen, and you forget that the reader doesn't really know or care that part.
Yeah, I remember having that problem when I was first drafting. In this final draft, I ended up taking out the first 3 chapters and getting right to that point. It was very hard to do because I thought for all this time, oh, this is important and this is important. So I built upon these 3 chapters, and then I'm looking at it after 2 people read it, and they're like, why do we have the first 3 chapters? Why can't we just get to the part where, okay, she's being chased by police in the car?
Those make awesome introduction and teaser things, though.
Yeah,
so don't ever throw them away, but they may just not belong in the story.
Yeah, or they're small. You drop hints to them or allude to them. Now, Gigi, do you have anything to add before I move on, or no?
I'm good, thank you.
Okay. Now, I've been thinking from the perspective of book 1 in a series or a standalone novel. Now, let's say I've written book 1 and published it, and I'm moving on to book 2. All of a sudden, the dynamic has changed in a way, because anyone who's picked up book 1 knows about my main character, knows about the story they've been through. So where do you start book 2, with story or with character?
Well, you already have characters. So who are they now? They are not the same person now that they were at the beginning of book 1. They're somebody else because stuff has happened.
So do you start off by
paper dolls?
Yeah, exactly. Do you start off by introducing how they're new, or do you start off by telling the story of what came next and then later on introduce the what's new in a later chapter?
The way that typically works the best, and none of it is universal, is that you start off with who they are now as if this was book 1, basically, right? Because what you don't want to do, you don't want to do a huge info dump of the prior book. You don't want to do a huge, here's how I've changed whatever. So you'll have to do allusions to those changes if they are important to book 2 as a standalone, unless you say, this is a continuing series. You really need to read it in order to get the grasp of it, right? Which some people love. It's think of it like serialization. Some people truly love serialization. Some people truly hate it. If I want to pick up a book because I'm intrigued by something in the story and it happens to be book 4, is my readership going to hate the fact that they'll have no idea what happened 1 through 3, other than maybe a tidbit or 2 I throw in? Or they're going to be fine and they can go back and look and they'll get more depth. It'll expand their view of book 4, but it's not going to preclude them from enjoying book 4.
So you're saying start with just sort of a quick recap of the character thus far and then getting into the story of what comes next?
I sort of start with, here's who they are today, as if I was writing book 1, right?
Okay.
Because the world is going to change, is going to happen, and this is going to be a story, right? So another thing, another shoe's going to drop, something's going to happen that will cause you to again go through the process of they're changing, they're evolving, their world's evolving, their story's evolving. Pick them up where you left them, maybe throw a few allusions to what happened before if it's important to know, and then move on from there. That's typically what I recommend. Don't, please God, include 3 chapters of the prior book.
Amen.
As the preference, the preface to this one, because no one will read it. They scan the book in the bookstore, they go, I've read that before, they throw it aside. It just takes people off.
Now, I have a question for you while you're bringing that up. What would you say about somebody including a preview of your next book inside, like, the end of book 1 to allude to book 2? Because that was what I was going to do.
I think that is useful, because what you are doing in that case is you are saying, look, this story continues, or this world continues, trying to hook them on either the next shoe dropping or the next set of characters, or however your progression is happening, right? But you can hook them on, look, here's another bad thing. And that's another use of where you want the story, you want the inciting event, what it's called, when the story really starts, to happen in that first chapter. Because if you then put the first chapter in the back of the prior book, they see the inciting event, but they have no idea how it's solved.
I like it.
No idea what happens. And then they want to know.
So I have to say that for my second book, which is coming out hopefully next month, if everything all lines up I have to say that I cheated. I took two other characters from the same world as the first book and kind of told their story, their experience on the same night as the two characters from the main book. But then all three of them, well, actually all four, maybe five, meet up sort of midway book two. So I guess if I had to do it the right way and not cheat, I would probably take Mora's advice in terms of starting, like where they are and then have like a new kind of like growth arc from there.
I
Just
think
remember.
sorry. I think one other thing to consider when we're doing story versus character is how important the point of views are that you're actually using. I know stories like Game of Thrones that have God knows how many. But then you could have ones that have like 2 or 3. Some of them might not be normal for whatever genre you're working with. But if you've got a point of view that goes nowhere, or it's just kind of info dumping about your main characters, it's not really going to go anywhere either. And I've seen some authors do that too.
Yeah, every character that has a point of view should have skin in the game. If you've merely got a character there who talks like some Greek chorus and proceeds off the side stage, there's no point. Again, you're not attached to them. Why are they talking to you? If they have a voice, they should be important.
Yeah, I have one point of view in my second book. Unfortunately, they're only there for the second book because the actions that they took in their past kind of caught up with them.
Yeah.
But it's to move the 2 main characters forward by this person no longer being there.
Yeah, that can be perfectly valid. There's nothing that says that the point of view character has to be the same through a series. There's nothing that says that the characters that you deal with have to be the same through a series. It really is a matter of, and it sounds very Machiavellian, that as authors, not only are you trying to tell a story that's interesting, you're trying to play upon the emotions and imagination of your readers. So sometimes you will do things deliberately to George R. R. Martin, kill off all your children, right? Because you're toying with your audience. You're trying to get a reaction, in particular, of a kind from your audience. And that's part of storytelling. That's the theater of storytelling.
That's true. Okay, well, my original question was, how do you start story versus character? In the book 2 that I'm publishing, just launching this weekend, I do a short, like you said, a recap of the character, sort of where he's at, his emotional state after the events of book 1, and then it gets into the story. EM, in the beginning of your book 2, how did you start it? How did you start your book 2?
Basically, the end of the first book is where the 3 people finally end up in a truce. And it starts off with her partner investigating their new assignment. And she's not due back to work until the next day. But the character that the guy is interrogating is somebody that she needs for her side job, which is street racing. So it kind of ties everything together.
Okay,
as you see this investigation going on, you kind of realize why this character is important, why he needs to look for this particular person, and where the story is going to go from there, which alludes back to her family.
So you basically started with story and then made characters sort of come next.
A little bit, yeah.
Very cool. Gigi, what about your book 2? Did it start off with story or character?
So it's kind of both. So it's sort of like the same, well, it's set in the same night and it's sort of the same event, but from the perspective of 2 other characters from the main character's school. And it's sort of like how they experience that apocalyptic event. But then when they all meet up again with the characters from the first book, they kind of like overcome a bunch of conflicts. And so in the first book, the main character is just sort of like getting over all these barriers that keep her from being like just really friends with a lot of people in her high school, but through, you know, some learned selflessness, she finds herself in a position to meet these other kids in book 2, and then they become friends. So it's just sort of like this weird loopy friendship story that needs sort of 2 different arcs to kind of like meet, and when all those people have kind of resolved their own challenges, then they're ready to become friends and meet up and just become a gang. So sort of a roundabout conclusion.
Awesome. Now, tell me a character that cannot get out of your head. Who is your favorite character, fictional character, or an awesome fictional character?
I love Anne Rice's Vampire Lestat. He just always stuck with me forever.
Very cool. Maura?
Trying to think if I have one that's stuck with me forever. Believe it or not, and it's going to sound very strange, Anne McCaffrey's Restoree book was one of the first books I read in science fiction genre that was really not pure science fiction.
Okay.
And sort of the way it was very character based, and the way she kind of played upon the emotions of the readers and how things worked out just was masterful storytelling to me. It's not, one of those great popular ones, but it was one of the teenage ones that sort of made me interested in writing.
But it was more the story that hooked you than the character. I mean,
no, the character, the way the character expressed things, and the way. So I grew up in a family that was very science fiction oriented, and we had all the old master stuff growing up. So I was used to reading hard science fiction, Purnell and Niven and all this sort of stuff. And this book by Anne McCaffrey was the first one where it wasn't 5 pages extolling the virtues of my ray gun, and was actually much more internally focused on the characters themselves. And that just sort of stuck with me, that it was a very kind of interesting way to tell a story that was different than what I was used to.
Very good. What about you, EM? A character that you just can't shake?
I don't know if you guys read the Sword of Truth series, but the main character from there, Richard, as he develops over the course of these, God, I don't know how many books they're up to now, but I remember reading it in middle school, and it was more on high school level reading. And I remember, how virtuous he was, and how he wanted to fight for justice and just find out the answers to who he really was and protect this woman that he fell in love with. I mean, and as you go on, you see how he and his woman change throughout the whole series. So I think because the series has continued, it was kind of hard to stop thinking of the characters sometimes.
That's true.
Especially when you anticipate a new book.
Yeah. I know a character that I cannot shake is, as Ian mentioned earlier, Locke Lamora. That character, between Locke Lamora and the supporting main character, Jean Tannen, those two, they had such a brotherly dynamic, and just the way they talk, the way they interact, the way they treat their world, those are characters that made me want to be a writer, because I wanted to make characters that were anywhere near as good as those ones. And so those for me are characters that I love. What about stories? Tell me a story that you loved. And the characters are important, but it's the story overall that really made you think.
I think the Harry Potter series. I mean, Harry Potter himself was just always sort of, actually as a character, like a little bit of like a wet noodle to me. But like, I actually kind of liked Hermione the best because she was like so gutsy, and I'm like, you go girl, you go. I kind of like, she's like my fictional alter ego. But I think the combination of the world and the magic and Harry's friends, who are way more interesting than Harry, those have just always been addictive, and those stayed with me for a long time.
That's awesome. Maura, what about you?
I actually think one of the ones that stuck with me for I don't know how many years now is Mercedes Lackey's Chrome Circle series. And it was one of the ones that she ended up stopping writing because she was getting death threats. But it was very much a modern day precursor to urban fantasy, elves in the current world, written probably 70s, I would say, 70s or 80s. And that world has always stuck with me. And I hear rumors that she's going to actually put another book out in it. So I'm going to be hanging around to see.
That sounds awesome. What about you, EM?
I think the one that I liked the story, but the characters were kind of was the Necroscript series that features Harry Keogh. Again, I remember reading this in high school. They're hunting vampires in the ESP department with people that have extraterrestrial powers. And they're talking about the Russian KGB, the USA, the CIA, all that sort of stuff. So I think what fascinated me was the fact they built this world upon the one that we're living in now. And I think it was more profound because I found it right after 9/11.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. I know one story that always gets me, and the characters are so-so, is the Lord of the Rings. I mean, everyone loves Lord of the Rings, but you do care. The movies really make you care about the characters individually, but when it comes down to it, in the books, you really just want to find out what happens next. I know the passages where Frodo and Sam are going through Mordor, obviously they're important, so you read them, but I never cared about them as much as I did after watching the movies. Whereas, the battle scenes with the other characters and everything that goes on in the world at large, that for me was really what I wanted to find out more. And another one like that is the Safehold series by David Weber. I don't know if any of you have read that. It's fantasy meets historical fiction meets sci-fi meets just this awesome combination. And the characters that they have are interesting. They're very relatable, very good. But it's just the story overall that you want to find out how he's going to make this technologically backward world, religion-dominated world advance thanks to these characters. And the characters are important, but it's really the story at large that drives it, for me at least.
Another one that's really fascinating that I ran into recently was Shannon McGuire's Indexing. And it's a really kind of your brain kind of wiggles at first when you read it. That all the stories in the world are sort of fairy tale takeoffs. So fairy tales are in progress. You have to stop them from going all the way through, or bad things happen to the world. It's actually the first book is fascinating, and I was just glued to it. I think I've read it twice and listened to it on audiobook once. The second book, I think, needed better polishing. You could tell it wasn't quite as cohesive, because I'm not sure it was ever intended to be a series. But it's an interesting world.
That sounds awesome. All right, well, that's our time. Thank you, ladies, so much for joining me. It was awesome to have you.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you.
To anybody who's watching, reading, listening, down below, there's going to be all the links to check out these awesome authors. Check out their books, their Facebook sites, their websites, and read all of their thoughts and stalk them as well. Thank you guys so much. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy.
Thanks. Congratulations on book 2.
Thanks.